March 3, 1944. Over the bleak gray skies of northern Germany, the B-17 flying fortress named ye-olde pub shuddered against the wind like a wounded animal staggering home. Its tail section was ripped wide open, 2 of its engines were dead, and the entire left wing bore the black scars of flak bursts. Every few seconds the fuselage groaned as if the metal itself was in pain. Inside, freezing air howled through shattered plexiglass and broken hatches. 21-year-old Lieutenant Charles "Charlie" Brown gripped the control yoke with hands so numb he could barely feel the leather of his gloves. The cockpit windshield was cracked into spiderweb patterns, frosting over with every breath. In the gun positions behind him, silence hung heavy. Not the silence of rest, but the silence of men too hurt, or already gone, to make a sound. Bremen was still behind them, hidden beneath a smothering blanket of clouds and smoke from burning factories. The raid had been brutal. Dozens of American bombers had entered that sky. Far fewer were coming back out. Flak had erupted in walls, not bursts. German 88mm guns tracked their formation with terrifying precision. Fighters, dozens of FW-190s and Me-109s, had dived through their ranks like knives through canvas. Charlie had seen his first mid-air explosion that morning. A B-17 from another squadron had taken a direct hit to the bomb bay, breaking in half before his eyes. He still saw it when he blinked. Tiny black figures falling through the white sky, their parachutes never opening. Ye-olde pub had been hit early. A shell had torn through the nose, killing the bombardier instantly. Another burst shredded the tail. The top turret gunner was hit. The ball turret jammed. In less than 10 minutes, the bomber went from part of a flying fortress formation to a crippled lone target, trailing smoke and oil across the frozen air. Charlie's co-pilot, Bill Andrews, lay slumped beside him unconscious, a smear of blood frozen on his temple. The intercom system had failed. The only sounds were the screaming wind, the low moan of engines at half power, and the eerie creak of an aircraft trying not to fall apart. For a moment, Charlie thought of ditching. They were losing altitude. At 25,000 feet, every minute was a fight against gravity and the North Sea's icy promise of death. But something inside him refused. Not yet. Not while there was even one heartbeat left behind him. He glanced down at the small photograph taped to the control panel. A picture of his parents on the porch in West Virginia, smiling. He clenched the yoke tighter. "Come on, baby," he whispered to the fortress. "Just hold together." Meanwhile, far below them, in a Luftwaffe airfield just outside Bremen, Captain Franz Stigler zipped up his leather flight jacket and pulled on his silk gloves. He had flown more than 400 combat missions. 22 kills were painted under the canopy of his Bf-109 G6. His commander didn't need to order him to take off. He had already heard the report. A lone American bomber was limping west, low and slow. Easy prey. Stigler adjusted his oxygen mask and slid into the cockpit. The ground crew saluted as the engine roared to life, rattling the icy air. Stigler's expression was cold and focused. American bombers had destroyed cities, factories, and lives, including his younger brothers. Shooting one down was no act of cruelty to him. It was justice. As the Bf-109 lifted into the gray sky, the roar of the Daimler-Benz engine vibrated through his bones. He leveled out and turned toward the last radar contact. It wouldn't be hard. A crippled B-17 left a trail in the air like a bleeding deer in snow. Charlie spotted the fighter first, a thin black shape in the distance, low against the horizon. His blood ran cold. No escort fighters, no help. The tail guns had gone silent long ago. He was sitting in a metal coffin waiting for the lid to close. "God," he whispered under his breath. "Not like this." His left hand brushed the flight controls, but the bomber barely responded. His right foot pushed the rudder pedal to adjust course slightly. The B-17 wobbled like a drunk staggering down a dark alley. The German ace closed in quickly. Within moments, Franz Stigler was behind the fortress, just outside of gun range. Through his gun sight, he saw the shattered tail section clearly. The 50 caliber guns that normally bristled with deadly threat were lifeless. The skin of the fuselage was ripped away in places, exposing jagged ribs of aluminum. One engine was feathered. Another smoked like a dying furnace. This wasn't a fight. This was an execution. His thumb hovered over the trigger. Then he saw something strange. As he approached to finish the kill, he expected to see gunfire or evasive maneuvers. Instead, the bomber flew straight and steady, not because of skill, but because it couldn't do anything else. Through the broken glass of the tail section, he saw the gunner slumped over, unmoving. He flew closer, closer still, until he could see into the waist section. The positions were empty or manned by men who could barely move. Blood stained the floor. One man was sitting against the bulkhead, trying to wrap a bandage around his leg with shaking hands. No guns were pointed at him, no threat at all. A memory flooded his mind. His commanding officer in North Africa, Gustav Rodel, a man who had once told him, "If I ever see you shoot a man in a parachute, I'll shoot you myself." Honor is everything, Franz. We fight like knights. Stigler had lived by that code even as the world around him descended into barbarity. Shooting down a defenseless bomber was the same as shooting men in parachutes. It would make him a murderer, not a soldier. But war had taken everything from him. His brother August had died under an American bombing raid. Bremen itself was still burning beneath the clouds. The simple act of sparing an enemy could get him court-martialed. His trigger finger twitched. In the cockpit of the B-17, Charlie stared at the fighter now sliding alongside his wing. He could see the pilot's face through the canopy. Blonde hair, sharp eyes, young, no older than him. He braced himself for the burst of cannon fire that would rip through the fuselage. He whispered a quiet prayer, not for himself, but for his crew. For their mothers who'd get telegrams, but the tracers never came. Franz pulled his plane alongside the bomber's wingtip, dangerously close. The slipstream rattled the B-17. Charlie's heart slammed in his chest. For a long moment, the two pilots simply stared at each other, enemy and enemy. Both sons of their own nations, both exhausted and frozen. Both far too young to have seen this much death. Franz raised his hand slightly, pointing westward. "Turn this way, go home." Charlie blinked. Was it a trick? A trap? No. There was something in the German's eyes that wasn't hatred. It was something almost impossible to comprehend in that moment. Mercy. Franz pushed his throttle forward and took position just ahead of the bomber, angling toward the North Sea. He knew exactly what he was doing. If he flew close enough, ground-based anti-aircraft gunners wouldn't fire. They'd risk hitting their own fighter. It was madness. If anyone on the ground saw what he was doing, he could be executed for treason. For the next 20 minutes, a German ace and an American bomber pilot flew side by side through the frozen skies of Germany. Charlie barely kept the B-17 level. Every gust of wind threatened to tear it apart. The right wing creaked loudly. In the radio room behind him, Sergeant Al-Sadok's breathing came in short, ragged gasps. In the waist compartment, Sergeant Hugh Pee Wee Eckenrode tried to move the tail gunner's body out of the way, fighting tears he couldn't let himself shed. No one dared speak. No one could believe what was happening. When they reached the coast, Franz slowed and pulled alongside the cockpit once more. Charlie looked at him through the cracked glass. For a moment, time froze in that sky. No war, no politics. Just two men in flying machines built to kill each other. Franz raised his hand to his temple and gave a crisp salute. Then he banked his fighter sharply, rolling away into the clouds, vanishing as suddenly as he'd appeared. Charlie exhaled a sound that was half sob, half gasp. He had just stared death in the eyes, and death had turned away. Hours later, after nursing the crippled bomber across the North Sea, Charlie managed a hard, belly-sliding landing at an RAF base in England. Emergency crews swarmed the aircraft. When they opened the hatches, they found 179 bullet holes, 2 dead crewmen, 4 severely wounded, and a plane that by all logic should have fallen into the sea long ago. Charlie stumbled out onto the tarmac, blood frozen on his face, oxygen mask hanging loose around his neck. He kept muttering the same thing to the medic holding him up. A German. He didn't shoot. He didn't shoot. No one believed him. Not at first. A Luftwaffe ace letting a bomber go? It sounded like a fever dream. But the damage on the plane told its own story. This wasn't luck. This was something else entirely. Back in Germany, Franz Stigler landed and taxied his Messerschmitt to the hangar without saying a word. He filed no claim. He told no one. One word to the wrong officer, and he could be court-martialed, even executed. In Hitler's Luftwaffe, mercy was not a virtue. It was betrayal. But Franz slept that night knowing that for one moment, he had been a man first and a soldier second. The war went on. Franz kept flying, though the Reich was crumbling around him. Charlie kept flying too, even as the air war grew bloodier. They never saw each other again during the war, but neither forgot. For decades after returning home to West Virginia, Charlie carried the memory of that German pilot like a ghost riding beside him. When the nightmares of flak bursts and fireballs came, that memory was the one clear light in the darkness. Who was he? Why had he spared them? He had no name, no face, just a flash of eyes through a canopy. In Germany, Franz tried to rebuild his life. After the war, he became an emigrant, starting over in Canada. He worked as a logger, then as a businessman. He kept his story locked away. Who would believe that a Luftwaffe ace had spared a B-17? In 1990, nearly half a century later, Charlie Brown, now a retired Air Force officer living in Florida, decided he couldn't let the mystery rest. He began writing letters to veteran organizations, Luftwaffe associations, and archives across Europe. Weeks turned into months. Then one day a letter arrived in his mailbox from Vancouver, Canada. I was the one. It read in careful English handwriting. The German pilot, Franz Stigler. When they finally met in person later that year, both were old men. Charlie with silver hair and a trembling hand, Franz still sharp-eyed beneath a weathered brow. When they saw each other across the hotel lobby, neither saluted this time. They hugged. Two men who should have been enemies, now bound by something far stronger than hatred. Franz explained everything, how he had pulled the trigger halfway, how he saw their faces, their wounds, their shattered plane, how he remembered his commander's words, how he knew he could die for what he was doing. Charlie wept openly. We were dead men up there, he told him, and you gave us back our lives. From that day forward, the two men became inseparable friends. They visited schools, air museums, and military reunions together. They spoke about honor, not as a romantic word, but as something real and rare. People think war is about hate, Franz said once in an interview. But sometimes it's also about choices. Hard choices. Their story spread across the world, earning the name, the Ghost Pilot of Bremen. Pilots and historians studied it, because it wasn't just a story about two airplanes. It was a story about humanity in the middle of a machine built to erase it. In later years, Franz would reveal something that haunted him. If his superiors had found out, he likely would have been executed for treason. I risked my life that day, he said softly, but I would do it again. Charlie often thought about that as well. The B-17 should have gone down in flames. Instead, it made it home. Of the 10 men aboard, 6 survived because of that decision. Their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren were alive because one man decided not to press a trigger. On March 22, 2008, Franz Stigler passed away at the age of 92. Less than a year later, on November 24, 2008, Charlie Brown followed. Their ashes were interred within months of each other. At Franz's funeral, Charlie's family placed a folded American flag on the casket. At Charlie's, Franz's family placed a small model of a Bf-109. Across two nations once at war, two families grieved together. Today, pilots still speak of that encounter as one of the most extraordinary moments of World War II. The U.S. Air Force Museum has a display about it. Aviation historians write about it not because it changed the outcome of the war, but because it showed that even in a war that devoured millions of lives, a single human act could echo louder than 1,000 bombs. For years after their reunion, Charlie and Franz would often meet for coffee. They didn't talk much about politics or strategy. They talked about flying, the wind, the feel of the stick in your hands, the way clouds swallowed sound. And sometimes when they grew quiet, they'd remember that morning in 1944, when one man in a fighter plane looked at another in a dying bomber and decided to let him live. In their final joint interview in 2006, Charlie said, "People always ask me if Franz was a hero, but hero isn't the right word. He was a man who remembered how to be human." Franz, sitting beside him, added, "If I had shot them down, I would have carried that weight forever. Instead, I gained a brother." The story of the Ghost Pilot of Bremen isn't just about warplanes, gunfire, or tactics. It's about what happens when the rules of war are broken in the name of mercy. It's about the power of choice in the coldest, darkest moments. And it's a reminder that courage doesn't always wear a uniform or carry a gun. Sometimes courage is simply choosing not to kill. If this story touched you, ask yourself, what would you have done in Franz's place? And if you believe stories like this need to be remembered, subscribe, like, and tell me in the comments. Because behind every great war story, there are moments like these. Moments where humanity whispers louder than the guns.